Unity has always been central in the language of the African National Congress. That has been true right from the beginning when the African National Congress was formed at the Wauchope Church in 1912 in Mangaung. In his keynote address, Pixley Kegasheme made unity the central pillar when he addressed all the various people who gathered there, and especially concentrated on the need of unity amongst the various tribes in Southern Africa. Throughout the decades, this issue never left the African National Congress and always contained within it the possibility of division, but at the same time, the foundation for keeping the African National Congress together as a political party that eventually evolved into a full liberation movement after the interventions of a younger leadership under Anton Lembede, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela. Unity, of course, was not always achieved. In fact, in the period of 1948 and leading up to the next conference, the next national conference of the African National Congress, there was certainly a lot of internecine fighting and disunity within the African National Congress. In fact, the young lions under Comrade Nelson Mandela and Comrade Walter Sisulu were accused of sowing disunity. And in fact, they were often regarded as a group that is leading the African National Congress to a point where there would be internal splits. But the continuation of a commitment to unity mostly managed to keep the African National Congress together. Of course, there were periods where the ANC failed in this mission for unity. One of those was when the Pan-Africanist Congress under Robert Sobukwe eventually broke away from the African National Congress. Another was in 1967, 68, and 69 in exile, when the ANC came very close to a perilous split because of the dissatisfaction of a younger leadership within Umkhonto we Sizwe with how the African National Congress senior leadership were conducting the business of the ANC in exile, and more specifically, how Umkhonto we Sizwe failed to operate effectively in the first operations that happened into the then Rhodesia and the so-called Wankie operation, which was part of the Lutuli detachment's first deployment to move through Rhodesia to South Africa. One of the people who ended up eventually being arrested in Botswana after that abortive mission stayed for a while together with a couple of other comrades in Botswana in prison, was then released and was able to return back to Zambia, was Comrade Chris Hani. Comrade Chris was deeply disturbed by the lack of proper planning that went into that first mission of the Lutuli detachment. Beyond that, he was deeply concerned about an elite within the African National Congress who were living relatively well, while the majority of rank and file members of the ANC were in exile, and more specifically, those who were in the training camps of Umkhonto we Sizwe were living in some of the harshest conditions, physically and mentally exhaustive situations, often deprived of the necessary food and proper shelter, and under serious threat from disease. Comrade Chris felt that there was an elite within the African National Congress who were taking well care of themselves and even of their children. Their children were easily passed from South Africa into exile and then went off to some of the best universities in Europe and in Western and Eastern Europe, while the ordinary rank and file members of MK were living under totally unacceptable conditions. There was also a sense of intolerance and, in fact, political dictatorship almost in the camps. That those who raised concerns about their living conditions, or who may have raised some politically diverse views from what was the prevalent political view, were subjected to the harshest of discipline. Some even killed. Others subjected to torture and to long periods of severe detention. All of these issues Comrade Chris started to raise together with a small group of comrades. Out of those discussions, and especially out of the dissatisfaction with which he came back from Botswana after that abortive operation of the Lutuli detachment, came the Chris Hani Memorandum. Now, this memorandum spoke clearly and without any equivocation about the issues that I've just raised. There were those within the African National Congress, amongst them also the then Secretary General of the ANC, Comrade Duma Nokwe, who was deeply unhappy about what was contained in the memorandum. Even Comrade Oliver Tambo was not happy because also he was severely criticized by Comrade Chris and the group of supporters that had gathered around him. Eventually, because this memorandum contained some very serious allegations and some very serious concerns, and also because Comrade OR realized that the African National Congress, after it had to re-establish itself and started to function in exile, was not working at an optimum and that there were reasons for serious concerns, he called the Morogoro Conference in Tanzania in 1969. At this conference, Comrade Chris and the group that surrounded him with him were severely criticized. In fact, a decision was taken to expel them from the African National Congress. Comrade OR himself, on the basis of the criticisms that were leveled at him, offered to resign as the then acting president of the African National Congress. In desperation, the gathering at Morogoro convinced Comrade OR not to resign and to return back as the president of the African National Congress. At the closing session of the conference, Comrade OR made a very important speech, and I want to open my phone now and read a quote from that speech right at the end of the closing session. He said, "Comrades, beware of the wedge driver, the man who creeps from ear to ear, carrying a bag full of wedges, driving them in between you and the next man, between a group and another, a man who goes round creating splits and divisions. Beware of the wedge driver, comrades. Watch his poisonous tongue." End of quotation. Now, I've heard this quote being used often to try and repress democratic debate and internal democracy within the African National Congress, especially by those who are at a particular point in the history of the ANC in a dominant leadership position. This is a very important quote, but it cannot be used in a simplistic fashion, because Comrade OR was certainly not trying to call Comrade Chris and his comrades out as wedge drivers. In fact, there is enough historical evidence that he may even also have included in this category of wedge drivers that he was referring to some of the senior mainstream leadership of the African National Congress at that time. In fact, Comrade Owa was very sympathetic to some of the issues that Comrade Chris in his Hani memorandum raised. And he managed to address those issues in such a way that he brought Comrade Chris and the rest of the group with him who were suspended from the African National Congress within a short period of 3 months back to full membership in the ANC. So he was not against serious concerns and internal criticism being raised. He also didn't necessarily see the criticisms that Comrade Chris raised as wedge driving. In fact, some of those who responded the most negatively against Comrade Chris may very well rather have fallen within the category of being wedge drivers. Over a period of time, Comrade OR managed to implement most of the issues and especially the recommendations that Comrade Chris raised in his Hani memorandum, which made a huge difference to the manner in which the African National Congress operated, and especially also how Umkhonto Sizwe was able to proceed and become a far more effective military and armed force within the African National Congress. Comrade Chris himself referred to the Morogoro Conference in 1969 and the aftermath as a watershed. He's quoted to have said, "After Morogoro, things became significantly better, and we never looked back." So, what can we learn from this whole history? First of all, it is important to work for unity, yes. It is critical, as Pixley Keghassem has said, in that opening first speech that he made at the launch of the African National Congress at the Vayub Church in Mangaung. My brothers and sisters, members of various tribes, we have to be united as fellow Africans. But there's also a lesson to be learned, that internal criticism and internal democracy can indeed save an organization, in the way that it helped to save the African National Congress from the divisions and the hiatus that it was beginning to descend into in the early period of exile, through the Morogoro Conference and through the criticisms that was on a loyal basis raised by Comrade Chris Hani and his fellow comrades. We are at a time right now in the history of the African National Congress where there are those who are very quick to call others divisive and factional, where there are those who came triumphant out of the 54th National Conference of the African National Congress and are not prepared to listen to the legitimate concerns that are raised by comrades who have not necessarily been part of the group that triumphed at Nasrec in December 2017. I would argue that it is extremely dangerous to simply demand that any criticism must be repressed. Furthermore, I would argue that it is extremely dangerous to be triumphalist about one's victories within the African National Congress. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, so to speak, we are all comrades. And ultimately, it is not for the one to say that he or she or a particular group has triumphed over another. Because the final intention must always be for the African National Congress to move forward, for the African National Congress not to be a triumphalist organization, and not to try and sideline genuinely and seriously concerned comrades within the ANC, but to bring everyone along so that the ANC can truly serve the people of this country as the leader of society. It does not help to try and kick people out. It does not help to try and come play games with the ideological positions of the ANC in order to serve your own enhancement and self-enrichment. There is one very particular rule that has to be applied in the ANC, and that is that the national conferences of the ANC as set out in our constitution must always be respected as the highest decision-making bodies of the ANC. And the resolutions that are taken at those conferences have to be accepted and implemented. There is no higher decision-making body. And the national executive committees that get elected at those national conferences are given a mandate through the resolutions that are adopted at each of the national conferences. Let me return to Comrade Chris Hani again. At the 1991 National Conference, the first national conference that the African National Congress held after it was unbanned, a conference which was held at Durban, known as the 48th National Conference of the ANC, a particularly contentious decision was taken about the suspension of the armed struggle. Comrade Chris Hani, who was then the Chief of Staff of Umkhonto Sizwe, was not consulted before the conference by the National Executive Committee about this decision. He was faced with the unfortunate circumstances where a resolution was tabled at the National Conference for Umkhonto Sizwe's armed struggle to be suspended and Umkhonto Sizwe eventually to be dissolved, without him having been part of the integrity of the discussion around that decision. He was very unhappy. But finally, conference ratified the decision of the National Executive Committee of the African National Conference to suspend the armed struggle. And there is a video clip where Comrade Chris talks about his feelings and experiences under those circumstances, how angry he felt, how disregarded he felt. But then he said something very important. He said, despite all those emotions that I had to be disciplined. I had to accept that this was the decision of the highest decision-making body of the African National Congress, and I went out and I promoted that decision despite all my misgivings, as if it was also my decision. Now that is what discipline is all about. That is what central democracy is all about. I think there are those comrades among us at this juncture in the history of the African National Congress who should learn from that incredibly disciplined example of Comrade Chris. It cannot be, it certainly cannot be, that the African National Congress at our 54th National Conference took pro-radical economic transformation resolutions, which included the restitution, the expropriation, in fact, of land without compensation, the nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank, the restructuring of the financial institutions, the banks, the insurance companies, etc., in a way that they will truly serve the empowerment of the majority of black and especially African South Africans, that we then behave as if those resolutions are not worth the paper that they are written on, that we do not make every possible effort to implement them. And in fact, that there are some senior leaders within the ANC, and I want to mention by name the Minister of Finance, Comrade Tito Mboweni, who tried to second guess those resolutions and say that the delegates at our national conference there at Nasrec were not fully capable of taking a decision, for instance, about the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, because they were not people with an understanding about how banks operate. Now that is arrogance. That is ill discipline. That is the kind of arrogance that causes divisions where we need not to have divisions. That is the kind of arrogance that undermines discipline within the ANC. So if there's one thing I can call for, and I will never hesitate to do so, is the need for us to be clear and unequivocal in our commitment to implement the resolutions of our national conferences. And the mandate that we have now, right now, as we are now almost halfway through the period after the last conference, moving towards the next conference in 2022, is that it is high time to implement the resolutions that were taken in 2017. Yes, unity is important, but it must always be principled unity. It must always be unity that understands the history of our movement, that listens to how the history of our movement speaks to us at this particular moment, right now, today. And that history tells us there is no need to try and force any comrade into an unsavory compromise just because you are in power. There are structures, there are constitutional provisions, there is a long history of precedents that have been set that determines how we deal with each other. And even if you triumphed, even if you were the victor in terms of whatever election took place, you still have to abide by those principles. You still have to acknowledge that conferences are the highest decision-making bodies of the African National Congress. And you have to understand what President Nelson Mandela and Comrade Walter Sisulu, whose 108th birthday we celebrated just 2 days ago, always taught us. No one, no matter how important you may think you are, no one is more important than the ANC. All of us are products of the history, of the culture, and of the various norms of the African National Congress as they have been established through our 108-year-long history. If we understand that, then victory is always relative. Then the future is always determined by the examples set by the past, and then the ideology of the African National Congress, and the manner in which we deal with each other within that ideology is what will save us from arrogance, from being opportunistic, and keep us together in unity. Until tomorrow.